In the past, it was a staple of kidnappings for the hostage to hold up a newspaper to prove that they're still alive. The problem with me is that I started reading the newspapers that I was holding up, although I'm still, as you can judge by our social media overlords, in captivity. Nevertheless, I'll try my best to get what news I can out to you given the constraints. First up, stories on the domestic news front that I'm tracking. Your daily briefing begins with the headline, RNC reports worst fundraising year in a decade. In it we read, on January 31st, the RNC, along with other Republican Party and Democratic Party national committees and congressional committees, filed their annual fundraising tallies with the regulator. The RNC, according to its year-end filing, brought in about $87.2 million in total federal receipts. That's a sharp drop from the about $241.1 million it raised in 2019, the last year preceding a general election. Moreover, it's significantly lower than the $176 million it raised in 2022. The GOP's primary committee reported that it had about $8 million on hand at the end of 2023. That's the lowest amount it had on hand at the end of the year since 2014, when it had about $5 million in the bank. Additionally, at the end of last year, the RNC was saddled with about $1.8 million in debt. By comparison, the Democratic National Committee reported it raised $119.9 million in total federal receipts in 2023. It also held $21 million on hand and was debt-free. On February 1st, DNC Chair Jamie Harrison posted on X that the Republican Party needs to pray for better fundraising. This may be due to the fact that we're living through an age of absentee candidates. It kind of was inaugurated in the last election cycle with Biden kind of famously, as they said, hiding in his basement, not doing rallies, not doing interviews. And then Trump imitated him in this election cycle thus far, dodging debates and, pretty much absenting himself from what's supposed to be the process. But it's very clear that they're considering it an irrelevancy. And that's dangerous because historically, in a republic, the people have to be swayed. They have to be persuaded to vote for somebody, right? That's why oratory was so important. That's why rhetoric was one of the chief skills that was to be acquired in the Roman Republic, because you had to convince the people, right? Only in a dictatorship do you not have to convince the people, and the art of rhetoric, the art of oratory, goes into abeyance, as this professor explains.
But really, we're looking at a jump of about 200 years to Rome. And Rome, of course, is fascinating because we are mainly interested in the relationship between rhetoric and, in this case, power. Why is that the case? We are going to look at Rome during the period of about 100 BCE to about 1 to 200 CE. And during those 300 years or so, we're going to only talk about two individuals. We're going to talk about Cicero. We're going to talk about Quintilian. But really what we're really discussing is the relationship between rhetoric and power as it is exemplified by the context and the historical backdrop of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. So let's start with Cicero. The relationship between power and rhetoric can generally be summed up in one small sort of idiom, and that is that the greater the need for rhetoric is built when there is a more decentralized government. So the more decentralized a power, the greater the need for rhetoric. The opposite is also true. The more centralized a power, the less the need for rhetoric.
One of the classic copes that is put out by authoritarian regimes is that they're making the government more efficient, run along scientific lines. And they complain about the inefficiency of the constitutional government that we had, ignoring the fact that those inefficiencies were on purpose, right? As part of the checks and balances. So you had different portions of the government pitted against each other so that no one man or small group of people could amass, unchecked power. And so the oligarch, the authoritarian, the tyrant will always say, "Oh, well, we're stripping away these irrelevancies. We're stripping away these inefficiencies, and we're going to streamline the government." That's one of the excuses of the totalitarian. that Justin Trudeau, as an example, in Canada, he endorsed when he said, how wonderful that the authoritarian regime in China can change its economy on a dime because they don't have to go through any of this, archaic, checks and balances system. They can just cut right through. But the problem with that is that you have a more fragile system. You have no backups once you essentially, it's like driving in a car and getting rid of the spare tires and saying, hey, I've made it more efficient, or telling a person, hey, why do you need 2 ears? I'll cut off one of those ears and I'll make you more efficient. Why do you have 2 lungs? Do you need 2 lungs? No, I'm going to, cut that out for redundancy's sake. At the end of the day, the common cold can take you out because your system is now, is no longer robust. And that's essentially what happens with the republics when they kind of degrade and decay into dictatorships. There was a great book by Melissa Lane. She's at Princeton, and she wrote a book called The Birth of Politics. And in it we read, another participant looks back to the greater effectiveness of rhetoric under the Republic, which, although torn by disagreement and civil strife, was genuinely governed by the convictions imparted to the people by its orators. He plays with the idea that in genuinely well-governed states, there is no need for orators. Orators reigned in Athens and Rhodes, not in Sparta or Crete. If a single wise monarch makes all the decisions, oratory would indeed be useless. And this is why it's dangerous to look on our modern kind of political scene and to see the unprecedented contempt that the candidates have for, kind of persuading the people, giving them ideas, saying, why I am the best person to roll and what's my platform, what are the best policies going forward. They're no longer making those arguments, which is, a very dire sign that we are, in fact, edging into, a plutocracy, a kleptocracy, whatever you want to call it. Microsoft, as an example, just kind of tipped its hat in that direction by saying that Microsoft is to disable computers of some users who share non-mainstream content online. But don't worry, as we head into the 2024 election cycle, we're totally not edging into authoritarian territory. Luckily, we can escape into international news. We read, farmers' protests have erupted across Europe. Farmers are holding protests across Europe, clogging the streets with their tractors, blocking ports, and pelting the European Parliament with eggs over a long list of complaints, from environmental regulation to excessive red tape. We're no longer making a living from our profession, one aggrieved farmer in Paris told CNN. While some of the most dramatic protests have been in France, similar action has been taking place in a host of countries including Italy, Spain, Romania, Poland, Greece, Germany, Portugal, and the Netherlands. Farming makes up just 1.4% of the European Union's GDP, the latest figures show. But protests in Eastern Europe last year over cheap Ukrainian imports, which saw lengthy blockades at border crossings, show how farmers as a group are capable of causing major disruption. Both national governments in the EU are now under pressure to quell the fresh demonstrations. It kind of reminds you that war can happen by other means, and I'll use as an example, pre-World War II. There was talk about the Aryan invasions, right? And that was common mainstream history. Since the 1700s. They had been kind of looking at the ruins, the remains, the linguistic evidence, and saying that, clearly there were invasions here by this group speaking this language, whose descendants we still speak today, Indo-European-based languages. After the war, because of the taint of Germany, they kind of wanted to abandon that. They wanted to hide it, obscure it, obfuscate it, so that it couldn't be used to unite kind of Western peoples as it had in the early part of the 20th century. So they changed the name from Aryan to Indo-European. And then come the 21st century, they changed it again to Neolithic farmers. And their theory, their claim this time was, there was no invasion. It was just farmers came in from the Near East, and these farmers had new techniques. And that's why everybody just decided to abandon their religions and their original languages, because they like the goods and produce of these farmers. Suffice it to say, whether you believe the current modern narrative or not, just that term Neolithic farmers being equated with invasion, and how the elites are kind of like terrified of that, which is why there's this article entitled "France Caves to Farmers as Ireland Solidarity Protests Kick Off." Two of France's main farming unions on Thursday agreed to suspend protests and lift road blockades across the country after the government announced measures they deemed tangible progress in the ongoing revolt against EU climate-driven initiatives designed to wean society off of evil, non-bug-based carbon-emitting food, while China, India, and the rest of the world laughs. One of the things that they're angry about is, the fact that they are taking away subsidies for diesel fuel under new green regulations. They're flooding the markets with cheaper goods that don't have to, abide by those same strictures. And one of the things that might be underlying this is, of course, people talk about, oh, well, they want to kind of starve the populace to kind of make them more amenable to repressive legislation. And that's true. But there's also another thing at play here. The fact that China has cut off a lot of rare earth elements to chip making, like lithium and stuff like that, silicon, silver, all these elements. And now governments have to source those materials domestically. So they've been sending out geologists to farms. And if you're a farmer and you happen to have some of these rare earth elements, they'll come up with an excuse to take your land through eminent domain. You may find that weird, but so do I. And it leads us into the News of the Weird segment. Black puppeteer sues after being accused of blackface during Black History Month. It's Black History Month? Oops, excuse me. Evidently, some censorship squad in Canada came down hard on a black puppeteer drawing on his Caribbean heritage to tell the story of Blackbeard. Silvestri's family, the puppeteer, had originated from Martinique, once the haunt of Blackbeard, and his shows had incorporated stories and legends from the West Indies. The puppet, named Max, is supposed to be a caricature of himself who steps into the story. Making look-alike and caricature puppets is common enough in puppetry, but the rules are different for Silvestri and his face. The puppet is black, so the activists in Red Coalition condemned his sponsors for tolerating a clearly racist children's play featuring a grotesque blackface puppet. The group charged his show was totally not acceptable. Silvestri said the puppet actually is a representation of himself, and his artistic license allows him to utilize a variety of comedic tools. But the government agency in the Montreal area gave in to the pressure group and canceled his show. So he's going to court, seeking damages for defamation from the chief of the Red Coalition. The report noted Silvestri's lawsuit mentions that Babineau had smeared him by derisively calling him a bon noir, or good black, and suggesting that he enables white supremacy. The report added Silvestri sees this as an issue of artistic freedom, but it's also a question of who decides what's racist. We used to associate racism with unthinking prejudice, and the response of Canada's professional anti-racism class was filled with unthinking prejudice. On seeing Silvestri's caricature puppet of himself, they immediately reacted with some very racist prejudices. Is free speech in Canada kaput? Is art dead with regard to our neighbors to the north? The subject of death leads us into our obituary segment. Prince Vittorio Emanuele of Savoy, son of Italy's last king, dies aged 86. Prince Vittorio Emanuele of Savoy, the son of Italy's last king, Umberto II, has died at age 86. The prince died on Saturday in Geneva, the Savoy royal house said in a statement. He had lived in Switzerland since the family were exiled from Italy when he was 9 years old. Vittorio Emanuele was born on February 12, 1937, in Naples to Umberto, Prince of Piedmont, who would later briefly become Umberto II, and Princess Marie-José of Belgium. Umberto ruled Italy for only 34 days after his father, King Vittorio Emanuele III, abdicated in an attempt to save the monarchy that had been discredited by his support of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime during World War II. It's interesting how the fascism of that time period was denounced and decried, while the fascism of this time period, as the previous story goes to demonstrate, is being upheld and people are looking the other way, and there's this massive amount of cognitive dissonance. But that's why I'm here, to eradicate that cognitive dissonance if at all possible. And I thank you for stopping by the show, or as I like to call it, that suspicious gap in my resume. See you next time. Consider subscribing to my new podcast, Classic Paranormal. It's a clearinghouse for lost real-life accounts of true ghost stories. It's found on Apple Podcasts. Go there now if you're interested in enigmatic tales, chilling true accounts, chronicles from cases of the past that time has forgotten, but that the modern person who likes relaxing by a campfire swapping ghost stories might appreciate. As I said, the new podcast I'm launching is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and there's a link in the description below on this video.